It was spring of 2017 in northern Ontario, and this year I had big plans. After 20 years of guerrilla growing cannabis along the outskirts of town, I had learned a lot through trial and error, mostly error. In the last few years leading up to 2017, I was finally having good success. As usual, I spent the winter months reading and learning more about outdoor growing, organic soil mixes, climated strains, and so on. I spent hours upon hours going over Google Earth, looking for hidden clearings with southern-facing exposure for maximum sunlight. I tried to choose locations nearby to hiking trails, ATV trails, pipelines, power lines, etc. My preferred locations were generally just off the beaten track, where pre-existing trails existed but also had low traffic, so I could freely get materials into the forest where I needed them. Each plant would need approximately 40 to 50 gallons of pre-made organic soil I had stockpiled behind a barn on a family member's property. Times that by 50 gallons per plant, by the 50 plants I intended to grow this summer, and it's not hard to see how much work I'd have ahead of me. Getting it all out into the woods where I would be digging massive holes for each plant. This might sound overkill to some, but if you want good results and you want plants that bear between 1 and 2 pounds per plant, this is how it's done. And this year I'd be doing it all alone. Before the snow was off the ground, I was already hiking into these locations. I had previously been studying on Google Earth to see if they met my expectations. I spent countless hours hiking into the woods, sometimes 3 or 4 kilometers back in the woods exploring, and once I had settled on the spots, about 10 locations, I would plant 5 plants per location, and that way I could grow monster-sized plants right out in the open, full sun, without much worry of losing my hard-earned work, should thieves find them. And not have to worry should the law find them, as my numbers were being kept low and spread out. I spent April and May out in the woods, alone, stealthily digging holes, hauling in copious amounts of soil. The work was grueling, and I lost about 30 pounds over the course of 2 months. I would spend 5 to 10 hours a day out in the woods, alone, 4 or 5 days a week, being eaten by mosquitoes, enduring the elements. I worked in the snow, the rain, and as the summer months set in, the blistering heat. I was determined to make my small fortune this year. Nothing was going to stop me. Finally, around the 1st of June, my holes were complete. My soil had been brought in, and they were ready to be planted in. Even getting the clones or plants out to the location seemed to be a big job, because of how spread out my locations were. But by early June, my plants were in the ground, and quickly began to make progress. Now all I would have to do is routinely come back and check on them, add water if need be. Nearing the end of June, my plants began to run into trouble as the leaves were being eaten by bugs, a problem I hadn't encountered and hadn't really had to deal with much in prior years. And since I was going all organic this year, I decided to look up how to make an organic bug repellent for plants. It's been a few years now, and I forget all the ingredients, but basically I used onions, garlic, chili peppers, cinnamon, oregano, and some other ingredients I can't really remember, and boiled them down into a pot of water to extract them into the water. Then I strained it into spray bottles. The next day I set out on my way, location to location, spraying down my plants. Fearful of drawing in deer to my plants' locations, I sprayed it here and there throughout the forest that day, and I went about my travels to try and confuse any deer that might be lured in by the scent. It was nearing the end of the day, around 8 p.m., maybe 8:30, and I was at my last 5 plants that needed to be sprayed. While I was there, I noticed a medium-sized maple tree that had sprouted its leaves and was now shading my plants from getting full sun. I had a small saw with me and began to try and cut the tree down. My saw wasn't very good and it was dull. The progress was slow, and as I worked away vigorously, trying to cut this tree down before darkness set in, I began to hear things in the woods around me, as if something was walking in a large circle around me in the forest. Armed with bear spray, I wasn't overly worried, but seeing as it was getting dark, I can't say I wasn't a little bit concerned. I began hearing knocking repetitive, like a hammer being beaten off a tree off in the distance. And knowing the area very well, I remember being a little confused about where the sound might be coming from, as it was very unlikely anyone would be nearby. I was about 3/4 of the way cutting through this tree and making little progress when I decided to pull the plug and head for home, as it was now almost completely dark, probably 9 p.m. or a little bit after. As I came out of the clearing into a large sandpit, watching my steps, always careful not to leave a trail into my spot, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Off to the right, about 50 feet off to the right, I swung around and there was a large black bear. I'll never forget, it was like he was stuck on pause, one foot still in the air. He stood there sideways to me, motionless, as if he was hoping I wouldn't see him. He was walking right into the area I was working. I pulled out my bear spray and began taking steps backwards. And now that he knew I was there, he turned towards me. He was unafraid, but didn't seem overly aggressive either. He would take a few steps towards me, then stop when I'd raise my voice at him. I began walking away, and he would follow, staying about 50 to 100 feet behind me or so. He was a big bear, maybe 400 pounds, and I was about 1.5 kilometers away from the barn and my car at this point. I would yell at him, and he would stop for a moment, then follow, stop, then follow. It started crossing my mind, what if this can of bear spray doesn't work? I called back to the house on my phone and asked the homeowner to get his rifle and head out to meet me just in case. The bear eventually decided just to go his own way, and that was the end of that. The next day I returned to the barn and was going to set out in the woods again, but when I got there I noticed my backpack laying out in the driveway, which was strange because I left it in the barn with the doors closed. Something had dumped all the bag's contents out into the ground, which had granola bars and other snacks in it. Also the spray bottle that was there that I had used to spray my plants. Strange thing is that if it were a bear, I would have thought that it would have eaten the snacks. But it was all just dumped out and left there. I looked around the area for tracks, and right away noticed moose tracks and baby moose tracks as well. And other tracks, big 16-inch tracks, that I figured must have been the bear. I went back out in the forest that day and found these 16-inch tracks every location that I went to. Again, I heard sounds following me, and I had a very eerie feeling all that day in the woods. When I had gotten close to home, I researched the bear tracks and how big they can get. I learned 16-inch black bear tracks are non-existent, and only a grizzly bear could have tracks that size. At this point, I had no idea what to think and was feeling very nervous of going back into the woods. Each day out there was always this presence like I was being watched. I found more and more of these 16-inch tracks, even stepping on a couple of my plants. I could tell that it was following my trails daily, and I would hear it behind me as I made my travels, but each time I'd stop and look, the noise would stop. Growing more and more weary each day, I did something I'm not proud of and would never do again. But it's the truth, so let the truth be told. I left poison mixed with soup in a bowl out behind the barn, still thinking in my head that it had to be an aggressive black bear that was stalking me. At this point I was scared and just wanted to be free of having to worry about being stalked by a bear. I returned the next day to see that the 16-inch tracks had walked right up to where I had left the poison. Whatever it was had drank maybe 1/6 of what I had left behind, then left the rest. Feeling spooked and a little worried that maybe a sick bear would be out there in the woods, I left for the day and came back a day or two later. I parked the car and made my way out to the barn when suddenly I heard a loud scream. A yell from a couple 100 feet to my left that sounded like a whoop, whoop, but it sounded like whoop, whoop, comparable to a Native American war cry in a movie. Then another call a couple 100 feet out in front of me. They called back and forth at each other, almost as if they said, "There he is." Then the second one calling back, "Whoop, whoop, get him." They charged through the woods at me as I quickly began walking backwards. The bush came alive, the pounding of heavy feet running through the forest at me, the shaking of branches and trees. I pulled out my bear spray, and just as they hit the edge of the tree line, they stopped. I went to get in my car and decided to turn around and pull out my phone and take some pictures of the tree line from a safe distance, or at least what I thought was a safe distance. And as I took pictures, I began seeing prints in the open in the fresh morning dew on the grass, and in the sand. This time there were 2 sets of tracks, one of which being 24 inches in length and looking like a perfect human foot. I was able to catch 2 pictures of whatever this creature was, and it had a very lionish looking face and stood approximately 11 or 12 feet tall. I called him Lion Man, and I'm still not convinced of what it was I encountered. Was it a Sasquatch, a Dogman? I'm really not sure. I went home and got my wife, bringing her back out to see the tracks, and upon further inspection of the area, we were able to find a spot where one of them had been watching me and had a pile of 6 to 8 softball rocks stacked up as if he had planned to throw them at me. This was the first of a few encounters that I've had with these creatures over the course of that summer, and in the end, I'd be ripped off for most of my hard work by a close friend, so I guess karma came back to get me in the end. But I'll never forget the summer of 2017 and the lessons learned.